Hi guys, today I'm going to show you how to make your own time lapses. I use a software called LRTimelapse version 6. I'll put the link in the description below so you can download it. And this is a free software to use up to 400 frames. Anything longer than 400 frames you have to pay for the software. However, for astrophotography, generally we're using 300 to 400 frames. So you can use the free version, and this will give you a final time lapse of between 10 and 15 seconds. So this is the software that I use, and I'll be showing you today how I edit it and how I use the software to make the stunning time lapses that you will see at the end of the video. Okay, let's jump right into making a time lapse using LRTimelapse version 6. And the first thing you're going to do is you're going to import the photos that you captured. Generally, you'll do this using a remote trigger or the intervelometer on your camera, and you'll take consecutive images, and this will then give you a time lapse. Now, I'm specifically focusing on this tutorial on astrophotography time lapse. However, you can apply this to sunset time lapses or other time lapses that you would use. So exactly the same method. The only difference you will find is when we do the editing, I'm going to obviously edit for astrophotography. So I shot a scene. As you can see here, these are all my raw files that I've imported into Lightroom, and I have 306 images that I captured of a time lapse in Namibia over a camel thorn tree, and I have the Milky Way moving across the camel thorn tree, and now I'm going to turn that into a time lapse. So once you've imported all your files, I suggest making a folder on your desktop or on a hard drive that you like to save your images onto. Name that whatever, Camel Thorn Namibia time lapse, and put all the files in that you would use to make the time lapse. This is so you have a duplicate of them, that you're not changing the metadata on your raw files, and you're keeping those safe and sound wherever you keep them. And we'll just be editing on the copied set to make the time lapse. So I've copied these 306 files onto a folder on my desktop called Astrophotography Timelapse Namibia Camel Thorn. And once you've done that and you've imported it into your Lightroom catalog, as you can see here in my library, we will then open LRTimelapse. And I'm using version 6.0.6, and they updated quite a lot, so there's always a new version to download, which is great, and they're constantly working on it. This is by Gunther Wegner, and I've put the link to download LRTimelapse in the description below. So now you'll go on the left panel, you can see my cursor there, and you will find the folder. I've put mine on the desktop and I've named it the Astro Timelapse Camel Thorn Tree, and you will just click on that folder that has your files in, and instantly you'll see the software starts to compile some data based on the information that you've provided to it. What you can see now in the top left window is your little thumbnail of what your time lapse will look like, and as it's compiling all the information and loading all the metadata, you'll be able to see initially and quite quickly what your time lapse will look like, and see if it's worth actually continuing at this step, or if it clouded over or something happened and the time lapse moved and you can't use it. So it's nice to quickly see this thumbnail of your whole time lapse pretty early on, so that you know whether or not it's worth pursuing the creation of this time lapse, because it does take some time to generate and compile it, especially when it's rendering near the end. So if I push this little play icon, what you can see, it's very dark. It's because we still need to edit the images, but you can see the Milky Way core slowly moving across the camel thorn tree that I've selected as my foreground. So this allows me to quickly see some cloud moving. Don't worry about it being too dark. This is pre-edit. This is just the raw information. But what this is showing is a brief glimpse of what our time lapse will potentially look like. Then the first thing we do is we go to Keyframes Wizard. We select that, and depending on your scene, If you have a large change in white balance or exposure, so if you're shooting a sunset or a sunrise, or there's a lot of cloud coming in or going out, I would suggest using a minimum of 3 keyframes. However, if you have a scene like this where not much changes from the start to the finish in terms of exposure and white balance, I generally use 2 keyframes, one for the beginning of the time lapse and one at the end of the time lapse, just to double check that everything was correct. So I have selected 2 keyframes for my astrophotography time lapse. Then we click on save, and what this is doing, it's saving that information, those 2 keyframes, to the metadata, so that when we go back into Lightroom, it can load that metadata and we will know which were the 2 keyframes. We will then go into Lightroom, and once we open our Lightroom, we will see all our files that we had there in our library. We will go Command A, and that is to select all our files. So we want to select all 306 files. Command A is the shortcut, or Alt A if you're using Windows. And then we're going to come up here to metadata, and we are going to go to read metadata from files. And what this is going to do is this is going to read the information that LRTimelapse saved onto the metadata, and now we're going to read it into Lightroom. Once that's finished reading the metadata, we're going to come down to this filter window, and if you see on the bottom right, there's a little drop down menu, and under here there are several options, from reading the full sequence to selecting the keyframes. And we are going to now select LRT keyframes. And once we select that, there we can see our 2 keyframes that we identified in the LRTimelapse software, the one at the beginning and the one at the end. What we do now is we just select the first one, and we will go to develop, and this is where we edit our images like we would normally edit our astrophotography photo. So I'm just going to do a quick edit on these just to show you how it works. But the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to bring up that exposure, maybe drop my white balance to something a bit cooler, maybe a little bit less purple. A useful tip to balance your white balance for astrophotography is to pull up your vibrance and your saturation, and then balance your warm and cool tones. So make sure it's not too blue or not too yellow, and also balance your tint. Make sure it's not too purple or not too green. So you can see, looking at this instantly, it's a bit too green, so we're just going to pull our tint down a bit, and it's maybe a little bit blue. I think that's too orange. I like it a little bit blue. Let's keep it a little bit blue like that, and then we can go and reset that vibrance and reset that saturation, and this gives us a very neutral place to start with our white balance for astrophotography. Other few little tweaks I'm going to do is I'm just going to maybe bump the contrast a little bit, and then I'm going to come down to texture and clarity. I like to pull the texture down for time lapses, just to smooths it out, makes it look a little bit softer, and the clarity as well, pull down by about 10 to 15. And then I'm just going to boost the vibrance, I think, on this one by about plus 10. Then I come down to my tone curve. On the tone curve, you make sure you want to be on the linear tone curve. And I'm just going to do a classic little S shape, just pull up my whites a bit in the middle and pull down the darks a bit in front. So just a very classic, very minimal S curve. And then I'm just going to go up and pull up my exposure just a little bit more, and pull the highlights down to protect those highlights, and then lift a little bit more of those shadows. Okay, that's looking pretty nice now, I think. Now we're just going to go and do some basic corrections. I'm not going to touch anything in the colors. You can adjust the colors as you wish. All I'm going to do here is just adjust my sharpening. I'm going to push Option or Alt and hold that down while you select the masking tool, and whatever's shown in white is what will be sharpened. So I only want to sharpen the edges of the tree and the stars. So I'm going to pull that up to about 80, between 80 and 90%. Noise reduction, I'm going to bring this up to anywhere between 20 and 30. And the color noise reduction, I generally bring that up to about 50. Then we can add our remove chromatic aberration and enable profile corrections. And I generally pull distortion back down to 0 because I find this stretches the stars on the edges of your time lapse, and we don't want to have any stretching near the edge of a time lapse. And so I pull that down to 0. And the last correction I'm going to make is here under calibration colors. I'm going to go down to the blue and pull this up to about 50. And what that does is you can see it just pops those orange colors and a little bit of those pinks in my image. So that's my final image that I've done. So now we've edited one of the keyframes. Now to go to the next keyframe is pretty easy. Make sure you've got the one selected, and then you will click Command or Shift to select the next keyframe. So that's selected. Now instead of going to sync like you normally would at the bottom, you have to use the script tool. So in Macs, the script will be this little icon at the top of your screen. In Windows, I think it simply says script at the top, and you click on it, and you will come down to this first one that says LRTimelapse sync keyframes. The LRTimelapse prefers using the syncing keyframes using the script method. It finds sometimes if you use the built-in Lightroom sync, there's a few issues and it gets a little bit buggy. So just if you can, just use the script tool, LRTimelapse sync keyframes. And what you'll see what it's done is when we go to our second, it has copied all of those settings across. And I think the first thing that you notice by going to that last frame in our image is that it's gone from these really nice sort of purpley blues to a very green image. So there we go, from those nice purpley colors to very green. So this is why we use different keyframes, so that we can make adjustments and corrections later on in the time lapse. So what I'm going to do with this is we're just going to do a few tweaks just to correct the last keyframe so it kind of matches the first keyframe. And to do that, I'm simply going to bring the white balance up, making it a little bit more magenta, and I might make the temperature very slightly warmer. We can see our highlights are pretty bright there, but they don't look blown or anything, so I think that looks fine. So I think if we look at both of those going between the two now, you can see our first one looks very similar now to our last frame. So we've just corrected for those, for that white balance. Okay, now we go back to library, Command A to save, and we're going to go metadata, save metadata to files. This is very important. We're now saving that information that we've just done to that file to the metadata, so that when we go back to LRTimelapse software, it's able to then read that metadata. So I'm clicking Save Metadata to File, and we now will go back to our LRTimelapse software. And the first thing you're going to notice is if you look at your thumbnail, you're going to see this yellow line, and where our keyframes were with these blue dots, you can see bumps. And this yellow line is our exposure line, and because they're bumps, it means we've increased the exposure, which we did in our edit. So we can see it's loaded that information now from our Lightroom edit. So what we're going to do is to make it load it all the way across, we're going to go auto transition. We're going to click auto transition, and you can see it's calculating, and now it's moved that exposure line all the way up, so everything's on the same line. So it's applying all those settings now to all the files. Then what it's going to do is going to make us a visual preview so that we can see what it looks like. And that's what this purple line is that it's busy doing at the moment. And it's going to make that visual preview for us. This sometimes takes a few minutes, so I might just skip ahead to when it's finished. But basically it's filling in all this information across all those 306 files that we did with the keyframe. And you can see on the thumbnail, it's busy building it, this little pink line. And it says, yeah, it will take 5 minutes and 30 seconds to build that preview for us. So just to make sure this video is not too long, I'm going to skip forward now till that's complete, and then we'll continue. It is just about finished. Doing the last 2 seconds, and there we go, it's done. And there's a little thing that is very important because that tells you it's finished. And if you go to the play button now, you can play and you can actually see what your time lapse will look like. How cool is that? I think there was an owl in that tree there when I was filming. That's pretty cool. So I'll play that again just to show you, and now you can get a good idea of what your time lapse will look like. So hit play and you'll get a great representation, a little thumbnail version of what the final time lapse will look like. So at this point, if you see, oh, maybe it was too dark, I need to increase the exposure, or maybe it was too cool and I need to warm up my temperature, you can go back now, make those tweaks, and then save the metadata to file again, and then reload it, and it will re-render for you this little thumbnail version before you do the final export, which takes some time. So you want to make sure you get everything right at this step, otherwise you're going to be wasting a lot of time making the same time lapse over and over again. The next step is the most important step that I find that this software really helps with. This is the visual deflicker, and that gets rid of any of that like flickering you see in a time lapse where there's a little bit of shimmering due to different exposures or things like that. And the visual deflicker removes all of that. So you can see as soon as I click visual deflicker, it's overlaid a green line over my pink line, and that green line is what's smoothing out any flickering or abnormal exposures to try and get a very smooth transition throughout the time lapse, and that is what we want. So for smoothing, I think base it's set on 20. I like to use 30 for my astrophotography, so I set my smoothing to 30. I always have more accurate ticked, and then I select multi-pass deflicker, and I generally set that to about 5 passes. You'll see the first pass takes a bit of time as it does it, but as it continues to do new passes over and over, it'll get quicker and quicker, and I just find if you do that, you get a very, very nice smooth time lapse from start to finish without any visual flicker. So I like to put at least a multi-pass deflicker of 5. If you find you're still getting a bit of flickering, you can ramp that right up to 10. And then I'm going to click on apply, and now it's going to apply that deflicker to my image. And this doesn't take too long. Generally it takes about 2 to 3 minutes, just depending on how fast your machine is or how much flickering you had initially to start out with. But I find for time lapses, unless you have a lot of cloud coming in or out, you shouldn't, or you have a car driving past, you shouldn't have a lot of flickering occurring in your time lapse. And now we can just do a play, and we can check if there's any flickering, but that looks great. Obviously it's going to have a bit of a shimmer. This is just a unrendered version of it, but in general all the colors look pretty good throughout the time lapse, so everything looks good. So in the new LRTimelapse 6 version 6, what Gunther Wegener's done is he's built in all the settings from Lightroom. So if you look on the right, there's all this panel here where you can adjust your exposure, contrast, highlights. That never used to be in the software before. You used to have to do everything in Lightroom the way we did it. I still think it's better to do it in Lightroom. I think the tools are just a bit better, and you have a little bit more control there compared to doing it in the software. Yeah, but if you don't have Lightroom, you can now use these settings in the software, which is great. You can also now export and render in the time-lapse software. However, I still think that the export and the render straight from Lightroom is still better for this version. I'm hoping in the new update that won't be necessary and we can do everything right here in LRTimelapse. But at the moment, I still think it's better to do the full render for your final video in Lightroom. So what we are going to do is we are going to go back to our Lightroom. We are going to go down to here where it says LRT Keyframes, where we selected before, on our right, bottom right, and we're going to go show us the full sequence. So LRT full sequence. Then we are going to go Command A. And what Command A will do is it's just going to select all the files for us, all 306 of them. And then we're going to go to the top, metadata. And all we're doing is we're just reading that metadata from LRTimelapse. So LRTimelapse has done all those changes to our files, our raw files, the metadata, and now we're just reading that metadata back into Lightroom. And what you should see, as you can see on my screen now, it's applying all those changes to the files. So you can see they should all get much lighter, should have all the same color as our keyframes. And then you can see that's happening to all our files. So you just want to read all that metadata back into Lightroom. This will take a few seconds, as you can see at the top, because it's reading it for 306 files. Let's just shrink those down, those thumbnails down, so you get a better view. And there we go. We can see it's busy reading all that metadata back into our files. Once this is done and it's finished reading all the metadata back into Lightroom, we are then going to save our files and it's going to render the video for us. This takes the longest time. This generally takes between 10 and 20 minutes. Depending on your system and how many frames you had. So this is the point where I'd say leave it to render, go make yourself a cup of tea, go for a walk, come back, and once it's rendered, then you will have your time lapse that you can play with. So very important to make sure up until this point you've got everything correct, because you don't want to now spend another 20-30 minutes rendering your file, getting your final time lapse, and it was too dark or your white balance was off. So you want to make sure that with your keyframes, and look at that little example time lapse in the little window on LRTimelapse, and get a good idea of what you want your final video to look like. Okay, so our metadata is just about finished. There we go. It's finished rendering all our metadata. And now what we're going to do is we're going to go File, Export, and in the left-hand window you're going to see LRTimelapse. It'll drop down. We are going to select the first one. Doesn't really matter which one you select. We can't do a lot of these things because we are running in the free version, so we can't export it 4K or 16 bits. What the options we have with the free version are 8 bits, JPEG. If we had the paid version, we could select TIFF files and 16-bit video. However, we are limited to that. What you want to do is you want to just select an output folder. I generally just let it do the auto, which is the same name as your other folder. Okay, so we're just going to say we want that to go to the desktop. I generally like mine to go to the desktop. That's perfect. And it's going to make a little sequence there. Perfect. And then we are going to click Export. Now this is the point where you will go and make your cup of coffee, because this is when it exports the 306 final files to render your video. It takes the longest time. So I'm just going to speed through this and then show you what our final few steps we have to do before we get our time lapse. Okay, once it's finished rendering, you'll get a window that'll pop up that'll look like this on my screen. And I have a few more options. The codec, just go with the MP4 file, that's fine. You can only go up to 1080p for output. If you want to get a 4K video, you need to pay for the full version of the software. And then quality, go for high, that's the highest you can go. And frames, I generally will put 24 or 25, depending on how long you want your video to be. But generally for the astrophotography, we want to try and stretch our frames a bit, so 24 frames per second is great. Color sampling 420 is fine, and everything else is fine there. And then aspect ratio, I generally keep it the same as what I edited at. If you want to, you can force it to a 10:16 aspect ratio, but generally I find what I edited at is what the aspect ratio I want it to be at. And once you've just double checked all those settings, then you will click render video. And this is going to just quickly create the final video. If you open LRTimelapse, while this is happening, and you look at the bottom left, you can see it is just rendering it all together. And this normally takes less than a minute. As you can see on the video that I'm doing, it's going pretty quickly. And then you'll have your final time-lapse video, and I'm excited to see what this looks like. So once this is finished rendering, it'll spit out an MP4 file for us at 1080p, and this will be our time-lapse video. Okay, doing the last few seconds at the bottom. There we go, that little ping, that's what we like to hear. And now I'll just spat it out onto my desktop. And if I open that file, we will have our little time-lapse video. And I will then show you the time-lapse now. And there we go, we have our time-lapse, some satellites whizzing by, and an owl in the tree, and our Milky Way moving beautifully across the sky. So hopefully that was useful, hopefully you guys enjoyed that. I'm going to put the video in its final form now at the end of this little session. And if you have any comments or any questions you want to ask me, please feel free to ask in the comment section below. I'm planning to bring out videos once a week, so please subscribe, put on that notification so when the new videos come out, you guys can watch them.